After 6 years of silence, my son-in-law knocked on my door about my new beach house. That single knock carried with it the weight of every birthday forgotten, every phone call ignored, and every cruel word they once flung at me as if I were nothing more than an old man past his usefulness. I stood frozen in the entryway, staring at the door as if it were some portal opening onto all my past mistakes, my sacrifices, and my buried pain. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. My daughter and her husband had cast me aside, treating me like a disposable object. And now of all times, they had come crawling back, not with humility, not with love, but with greed in their eyes and entitlement in their hearts. You won't believe what I saw in their faces when I opened that door. I had imagined this moment in countless ways during those long years of silence. Sometimes I pictured my daughter running back into my arms with tears, confessing regret and begging for forgiveness. Other times, I saw myself collapsing into her embrace, relieved that the nightmare of estrangement was finally over. But I had never imagined this. The sharp suit of my son-in-law, the smug tilt of his chin, the forced smile that barely disguised his contempt. Behind that grin, I saw hunger. Not for family, not for reconciliation, but for something material, something tangible. And I knew at once why he had come. The beach house. It wasn't just a property to me. It was the symbol of everything I had rebuilt after they abandoned me. I bought it with the savings I had scraped together from decades of hard work, the money I could have spent traveling the world, indulging myself or living comfortably years ago. But I never did, because every cent had gone into their futures, my daughter's education, her wedding, his failed business ventures. When they walked away, slamming the door of family in my face, I thought my story was over. But I started again, brick by brick, dollar by dollar, and that beach house became my monument to survival. And now here he was, at my door, acting as though he had every right to knock. "Father," he said, the word rolling off his tongue like a bitter pill he had coated in sugar. "We heard about your new place. Thought we'd stop by. It's been too long." His words stabbed at me, not because of their surface meaning, but because of the hypocrisy dripping from each syllable. 6 years. 6 years where he and my daughter treated me as though I were dead. 6 years of empty chairs at Christmas. 6 years where not once did they let me see the faces of my grandchildren. And now, suddenly, I was father again, a man worth acknowledging. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I let the silence stretch. In that moment, I wanted him to feel what I had felt for years, the suffocating emptiness, the unspoken rejection, the endless echo of nothing. My hand tightened on the doorknob, but my eyes never left his face. I could see his smile twitching, the corners of his mouth fighting against impatience. Arrogance was his armor, and entitlement was his weapon. But I had been forged in fire, and I was no longer the man he once dismissed so easily. I opened the door wider, letting the light of my home fall across him like a spotlight. "Yes," I said, my voice calm but heavy. "It has been too long." His eyes flicked past me, scanning the hall as though my daughter and their children might appear from the shadows. They weren't there. They hadn't come. He was the vanguard, the strategist, the one sent to test the waters. And though he thought he was the predator, I already knew he was walking into a trap of his own making. All my life, I believed that sacrifice was the purest form of love, and for decades I lived by that belief, pouring every ounce of strength, time, and money I had into giving my daughter a future brighter than anything I could have imagined for myself. And in doing so, I carved out a life that was never about luxury, never about indulgence, but about making sure she never had to taste the bitter struggles I had endured as a young man working 3 jobs just to keep a roof over my head. I can still remember the nights when exhaustion dragged my body toward collapse, when the calluses on my hands ached and cracked, when the small comforts that other men allowed themselves, new clothes, vacations, even a warm dinner at a restaurant, were luxuries. I refused, because each dollar saved was another brick laid in the foundation of her future. Every step I took was for her, every choice, every denial of self, and I told myself it was worth it, because one day she would see the depth of my devotion. I worked through storms, through sickness, through back-breaking labor, and still I never complained, because the vision of her in a cap and gown, standing on a stage receiving her diploma, was the fuel that kept my weary bones moving. When that day finally came, tears blurred my vision as I watched her, radiant and proud, and I thought my sacrifices had borne fruit at last. But the truth was, my sacrifices had only just begun. She wanted a wedding befitting her dreams, and though the cost was astronomical, I smiled through the strain and gave her everything she asked, for the ornate venue, the hundreds of guests, the designer dress, never letting her see the weight of the bills pressing down on me, never letting her hear the gnawing question in my head of how much longer I could keep breaking myself for her happiness. I told myself that it was the least I could do, that a father's duty did not end with a diploma, and when the day arrived and she walked down the aisle glowing like a vision, I thought my chest would burst with pride. I had given her the fairy tale she wanted, and when she said her vows, I believed I was handing her into safe hands. I was wrong. The man she married, my son-in-law, was ambitious but reckless, charming in words but careless in action, and when his first business venture collapsed, he came to me with desperate eyes and persuasive promises. He said he only needed a little help to get back on his feet, that with my support he could provide the life my daughter deserved. Against the protests of my own common sense, I handed him not just money but trust, believing that if I sacrificed one more time, perhaps the last time, I could secure my daughter's happiness forever. But businesses crumble faster than dreams, and the money vanished into failure after failure, until I had emptied savings that should have been for my retirement, for my own peace in the twilight years of my life. Still, I told myself it was worth it, because every father wants his daughter to be secure, to be loved, to never know hunger or hardship, and I swallowed my doubts, smiled when they boasted of their grand plans, and told myself that one day they would understand what I had given up for them. Looking back now, I see a man who gave everything, who denied himself joy so that others could flourish, who bore burdens silently so that his daughter might never have to carry them. And I see the cruel irony of it all, because those sacrifices that should have been remembered as love became invisible in their eyes, erased as though they had never existed. I worked my hands raw for a daughter who would one day cast me aside. I financed the dreams of a son-in-law who would come to see me not as a father but as a bank. And through it all, I kept telling myself that love meant sacrifice, never realizing that when sacrifice is unappreciated, it becomes nothing more than fuel for someone else's greed. I will never forget the night when the thin thread that still tied me to my daughter snapped, because it wasn't some gradual drifting apart or a quiet fading of contact. It was a brutal severing, delivered in words that cut deeper than any knife, words that echoed in my mind for years like a curse. It happened on an evening that was supposed to be filled with joy. A family dinner I had arranged in hopes of spending a little time with my grandchildren, to see their faces light up when I handed them the toys I had saved up to buy, small treasures compared to the lavish gifts their parents showered them with, but chosen carefully with love. I arrived at their house, carrying those gifts in my arms, my heart light with anticipation. But before I even crossed the threshold, I saw the look in my son-in-law's eyes, cold, calculating, already irritated that I dared to intrude upon their carefully cultivated image of independence and superiority. My daughter appeared behind him, her smile forced, her eyes darting nervously as if she knew what was coming but didn't have the strength or the will to stop it. I tried to step inside, eager to hear the laughter of the children, but he blocked my way with an outstretched arm and a smirk that told me he had been waiting for this moment. "We need to talk," he said, and those words carried a finality that chilled my bones. What followed was not a conversation but an execution, delivered with a practiced cruelty that left me reeling. He told me that I was becoming a burden, that their lives were moving forward while I was clinging to the past, that my constant presence and my reminders of everything I had given them were suffocating their family. And then, like a blade driven straight into my chest, he said the words that still make my stomach twist even now. "We don't need you anymore." My daughter stood there silent, her head lowered, and in her silence I heard her agreement louder than any shout. I turned to her, hoping, begging with my eyes for her to contradict him, to tell me that it wasn't true, that she still loved me, that I was still her father. But all she said, in a small voice that trembled with discomfort but not with love, was, "Dad, maybe it's best if we have some space." Space. As if the years of toil, the sleepless nights, the sacrifices that had carved me into the man I was meant nothing more than clutter in their shiny new lives. I asked about the children, about when I would see them next, and the answer struck like lightning. "It's confusing for them when you're around too much. They need stability." Stability. As if my love, my presence, my devotion were instability, as if I were a threat to the very family I had helped build. I stood there holding the gifts, my hands trembling, my throat tight with unspoken words, and for a long moment I couldn't breathe. I wanted to scream, to demand how they could erase everything I had done, how they could strip me of my place not only as a father, but as a grandfather. But all I could do was stand there as the door slowly closed in my face, the laughter of my grandchildren muffled behind it, fading away like a song I would never hear again. I walked back to my car that night with the toys still in my arms, the street lights casting long shadows over me, and each step felt like the ground itself was rejecting me. That was the first betrayal, the night I learned that love can be discarded like trash, that years of sacrifice can be dismissed with a smirk and a cruel phrase, and that the people you would have died for can one day look at you and see nothing but a burden. The 6 years that followed were not measured in seasons or calendars, but in absences, in empty chairs at dinner tables, in silence so heavy it pressed against my chest like an invisible weight, suffocating me slowly day by day. Birthdays came and went without a single phone call, no candlelit cake shared with family, no cheerful voices singing my name, only the hollow echo of the clock ticking on the wall as I sat staring at a cold meal I had cooked for myself. Each year, I told myself I wouldn't hope, that I wouldn't let the day sting me again, but hope is a cruel parasite that never fully dies, and every time the phone rang, I felt that jolt of desperate anticipation, only for it to be a telemarketer or a wrong number. Christmas was worse, the loneliest of all, because the world around me seemed drunk on togetherness, streets glowing with lights, neighbors carrying gifts, families reunited in laughter, while my house sat in darkness, a silent tomb to all the memories that would never be made. I used to buy small presents for the grandchildren anyway, stacking them in a closet year after year, wrapped carefully, but never delivered. Each one a silent testament to a love that had nowhere to go. Sometimes I would take them out, unwrap them, and donate them to charity, telling myself at least some child somewhere would smile. But deep down I knew I was only trying to ease the ache of knowing my own flesh and blood would never see the care I had poured into those choices. Holidays blurred together, one indistinguishable from the next. The same routine of sitting in my living room, staring at a family portrait taken years before, back when my daughter still leaned her head on my shoulder and my grandchildren still clung to my legs with laughter. I would trace their faces with my eyes, memorizing every detail, terrified that one day the memory would fade and I would no longer recognize them. Sometimes I would write letters to them, letters filled with stories, advice, and confessions of love. Letters I never sent because I knew they would never reach them, or worse, they would be discarded without being read. Each letter became a ritual, a way of bleeding out the loneliness onto paper. Even as the stack grew taller in the drawer by my bed, a mountain of unsaid words to children who were being raised to forget me. The silence was not just theirs, though it became mine too, because shame kept me from telling others. Friends would ask how my daughter was, how the grandchildren were growing, and I would paste on a smile and change the subject, unwilling to let them see the truth that I had been exiled from my own family. I carried the silence like a coffin on my shoulders, every day heavier than the last. Nights were the cruelest. The house would creak and shift around me, and in that darkness my mind would replay the night of betrayal, those words, "We don't need you anymore," burning like brands across my thoughts. I would imagine their lives without me, birthdays and celebrations I wasn't invited to, milestones I wasn't allowed to witness, and I wondered if my grandchildren even remembered my face, or if I had become nothing more than a story told in passing, twisted and distorted by the very people who had cast me aside. 6 years of silence can carve canyons in a man's heart, and it did in mine. But in those empty spaces, something else began to grow, not hope anymore, not longing, but something colder, sharper, a resolve forged out of grief and hardened by isolation. I realized that if I was ever to break free from the prison they had locked me in, I couldn't do it by begging for their love or waiting for their return. I had to build something for myself, something that stood as proof that I was more than the discarded relic they had painted me to be. And so, in the midst of that crushing silence, I began to plan my resurrection. The beach house was more than wood and nails, more than paint and plaster, more than windows that looked out over the endless horizon of the sea. It was the embodiment of my survival, the proof that even after being cast aside like debris, I could rise again and carve out a life that belonged to me and no one else. I bought it with money that should have been my retirement cushion, the fund I had intended to live on quietly in some modest home. But after 6 years of silence, I decided I would not spend what remained of my days shrinking into the background of life. I would not live in the shadows of rejection. I would build something that stood as tall and proud as my dignity. The first time I saw it, weather-beaten and weary from neglect, sitting at the edge of the shore like an old sailor who had endured too many storms, I felt something stir inside me, something I thought had died long ago. It was not just a house, it was potential, a chance to take all the pain, the bitterness, the grief, and pour it into walls that would hold not memories of betrayal, but memories of renewal. The ocean stretched endlessly beyond it, waves crashing with a power that mirrored the storm I had carried in my chest for years, and I knew at once that this place was meant for me. It was not a palace, not the kind of property my daughter and her husband flaunted to their friends, but it was mine, and in that simple ownership was a freedom I had almost forgotten existed. I spent months repairing it. Each nail I hammered into the frame, a declaration that I was not broken. Each brushstroke of paint, a refusal to let their cruelty define the rest of my life. I fixed the roof that leaked when the rains came, replaced the windows so that light poured in where once there had been gloom, polished the floors until they shone, and with each act of restoration, I felt as though I were piecing myself back together too. I remember standing on the porch at sunset after finishing a long day of work, the air thick with salt, the sky burning orange and red, as if the universe itself were applauding my determination. And for the first time in years I smiled without bitterness. The house became my sanctuary, a place where silence no longer tormented me but comforted me, because this silence was chosen, not forced. Here I could sit and listen to the waves crash, and know that every sound was mine, that I owed nothing to anyone, that I had finally taken control of my own story. It was not lost on me that the house symbolized everything my daughter and her husband had tried to strip from me: my independence, my pride, my ability to provide for myself without bowing to their approval. They had taken my sacrifices and called them burdens, but this house was the proof that I could turn my back on their judgment and still build something lasting, something beautiful. Sometimes I would sit on the porch with a cup of coffee and imagine my grandchildren running through the sand, their laughter filling the air. But I never allowed myself to linger on that fantasy for long, because this house was not built for them, it was built for me. It was my line in the sand, my declaration that their abandonment had not destroyed me, and though it carried scars, like me, it stood strong against the relentless tide. When I signed the papers and received the keys, I felt as though I were reclaiming my life from the ashes, and I swore then that no one, not my daughter, not her husband, not anyone would ever take this sanctuary away from me. It was more than a beach house. It was my rebirth. The knock came on a quiet afternoon when the sea breeze was drifting lazily through the open windows of the beach house, and I was savoring the kind of peace I had fought tooth and nail to reclaim. And at first I thought it might be a delivery man or a curious neighbor. But something in the rhythm of that knock, sharp and deliberate, made my stomach tighten before I even reached the door. When I opened it, there he stood, my son-in-law, dressed in his usual air of smug importance, the kind of man who believed the world bent to his charm, a faint smirk tugging at his lips as though the 6 years of silence had never existed. For a moment I could only stare, stunned not by his presence but by the audacity of it, because this was the same man who had barred me from my daughter's home, the same man who had told me with cold certainty that I was no longer needed, the same man who had robbed me of my grandchildren with a casual cruelty that still burned in my memory. And now here he was, as though time had erased all of that. "Well, Father," he said smoothly, leaning on the word as though it were a badge of respect, instead of the weapon he had stripped from me years ago. "I heard about your new place. Thought maybe it was time we reconnected." His eyes flicked over my shoulder into the house, assessing it, measuring it, already imagining what it might give him. And in that glance, I saw everything I needed to know. This was not a visit of love, not a gesture of reconciliation. It was hunger, plain and simple. He wanted what I had built, what I had earned in the ashes of their betrayal. I let him stand there in the doorway, the salty wind whipping between us, and I studied him in silence because I wanted him to feel the weight of it, the discomfort of a man who could not charm his way past the cold eyes of someone who finally saw through him. His smirk faltered for only a heartbeat before returning, though this time it was thinner, tighter, stretched like a mask that might slip at any second. "I was thinking," he continued, his tone light, almost casual, "that maybe the kids could come down for a visit, see their grandfather, enjoy the beach. We could make it a family thing. This house is perfect for that, isn't it?" His words were coated in sugar, but every syllable was poison, because I knew the children were nothing but a bargaining chip, a lure meant to soften me. And behind his suggestion was the unspoken demand that the house, my sanctuary, be absorbed into their lives as if it had always belonged to them. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I let the silence grow. The same kind of silence I had been forced to endure for 6 long years. The silence of birthdays without calls, of Christmases spent alone, of grandchildren's voices stolen from me. I wanted him to feel it now, to squirm under it, to taste just a fraction of what he had inflicted on me. He shifted his weight, adjusted his tie, glanced at his watch as though he had better places to be, and I saw in him the arrogance of a man who thought he had already won, who believed that age and loneliness would have weakened me enough to accept whatever scraps of affection he offered. But I was not the same man he had abandoned. I finally said, calm and deliberate, "It has been 6 years." My words hung between us like thunder, and though he tried to maintain his composure, I saw his smirk twitch, saw the impatience flash in his eyes before he quickly covered it. "Yes, too long," he replied quickly, his voice tightening. "But we can fix that now, can't we?" Fix it. As though betrayal could be patched over with a smile, as though silence could be erased with a few words, as though the past could be rewritten simply because he had decided he wanted something from me. In that moment, standing in the doorway of the house I had built with my own sweat and resolve, I knew this was not his beginning. It was mine. I stood in the doorway, with my son-in-law's rehearsed smile beaming at me. His voice dipped in honey as he spoke of family and togetherness. But beneath that mask of politeness, I heard the echoes of every cruel word he and my daughter had once spat at me. Words that had pierced me deeper than any blade. Outwardly I kept my face still, my voice steady, because I knew he expected me to crack, to leap at the chance for reconciliation, to be so desperate for a scrap of affection that I would forget the past. But inside my mind was a storm, replaying every moment of their betrayal in sharp, merciless detail. I remembered the night he had sneered and called me a burden, as though the sacrifices I had made for them had been shackles instead of gifts, and how my daughter had stood by silent, her silence louder than any insult. I remembered the phrase that haunted my nights, that hissed through my dreams like a curse, "We don't need you anymore." Those words had stripped me of my identity, had made me question whether the decades of labor, of missed meals, of unbought comforts had been for nothing. And as I looked into his smug eyes now, I realized he thought I had forgotten, that time had dulled the pain, but time had only sharpened it into something colder, something unbreakable. He spoke of the grandchildren as if dangling them like bait, his tone feigning warmth while his eyes betrayed calculation. And in my mind I heard again the justification they had given years ago when they shut me out. "It's confusing for them when you're around too much. They need stability." Stability, they had called it, as though a grandfather's love were chaos, as though my presence were poison. I remembered the sound of the door closing in my face, the laughter of the children muffled behind it, and I remembered walking away with their unopened gifts clutched in my trembling hands. Now here he was, talking of visits and family gatherings, and the hypocrisy of it churned in my chest like acid. Still, I smiled faintly, a controlled expression that revealed nothing of the fury inside me, because I knew that patience was my weapon now. If he wanted to play polite, I would let him, because behind my calm nods and measured responses lay a resolve he could never fathom. His words dripped with pretense. "We've missed you, Father. The children have missed you. This house, what a wonderful place for us to come together again." I let him speak, let him weave his false tapestry of sentiment, while in my mind the truth blazed like fire that he had never missed me, that the children had been taught to forget me, that this sudden affection was nothing more than hunger for what I had built with my own two hands. My silence forced him to keep talking, his tone growing more insistent, his smile harder to maintain, and all the while I stood as still as stone, feeling the years of bitterness harden into iron within me. I was not the desperate old man he thought I was. I was a man who had endured abandonment, loneliness, and grief, and emerged with a strength they had underestimated. And so I let the mask of politeness stay on my face, because I knew that one day soon I would rip the mask from his, exposing the greed and contempt that lay beneath. And when that day came, every cruel word they had ever spoken would boomerang back on them with a vengeance. "We don't need you anymore." Those 5 words have lived inside me like a parasite, feeding on my memories, poisoning every thought I tried to hold on to about family, about love, about sacrifice. They were not shouted in rage or whispered in sorrow. They were delivered with cold certainty, as if I were a tool that had worn out its usefulness, as if decades of sleepless nights, of aching bones, of sacrifices, stacked one upon another, had all been a temporary loan they had finally decided to stop collecting on. I hear those words in the quiet of the night, when the sea outside my window grows still. I hear them when I try to remember the sound of my grandchildren's laughter. I hear them when I see families passing me on the beach with their children clinging to them, never doubting their place. "We don't need you anymore." What did it mean, really? Did it mean my daughter no longer needed the man who had held her hand when she was sick, who had worked himself raw to put her through school, who had walked her down the aisle with tears of pride burning in his eyes? Did it mean my grandchildren didn't need the grandfather who had once been their safe place, their storyteller, the one who dreamed of teaching them to fish, to build, to live with dignity? Or did it mean that my son-in-law no longer needed my wallet, no longer needed my labor, no longer needed me to patch up the holes in his reckless ventures? I replay those words, and every time the cruelty cuts deeper, because they weren't just telling me I wasn't needed, they were telling me I wasn't wanted, that my love was an inconvenience, that my presence was a disruption. I remember standing on that doorstep, the weight of those toys in my arms, gifts I had chosen with care, and hearing my daughter, my own flesh and blood, say quietly, "Dad, maybe it's best if we have some space." Space, the polite translation of exile. And then the door closed, and with it, the chapter of my life that I had built around them slammed shut. 6 years passed, but those words never faded. I tried to bury myself in work, in repairs, in routines, but like a ghost they haunted every corner of my mind. I would sit alone at the kitchen table, the chair across from me empty, and I would whisper it aloud to myself, "We don't need you anymore," as though repeating it enough times might drain it of its power. But it never did. It remained sharp, jagged, digging into me until even joy felt foreign, until every attempt at moving forward seemed to circle back to that one night, that one moment, when the people I loved most reduced me to nothing. And yet, inside the wound it created, something else began to form. For years, I thought of myself as discarded, but slowly, painfully, I began to see that maybe it was not me who was unnecessary. Maybe it was them who were blinded by greed, by arrogance, by the delusion that love can be measured only by what can be extracted. We don't need you anymore. Those words were meant to end me, to silence me, but instead they became the forge where I was remade. They severed the bond, yes, but in doing so, they freed me from being their crutch, their scapegoat, their silent benefactor. I still ache. When I hear them echo in my mind, I still feel the sting as though it were yesterday, but now the ache is tempered with resolve, a cold fire that pushes me forward. Because if they believed I was no longer needed, then they would learn, in time, just how wrong they were. It didn't take long for the mask to slip, because arrogance has a way of seeping through no matter how carefully someone tries to hide it. And as my son-in-law stood in my doorway weaving his web of false warmth, I saw the cracks forming in his performance. He spoke of family, of reconnecting, of how the children would love running across the sand, but his eyes never lingered on me. They roamed over the house, over the polished floors, the freshly painted walls, the view of the ocean framed perfectly through the windows. He was assessing it like a predator circling prey, calculating its value, imagining its uses, and in that look I knew his true motive long before his mouth betrayed him. Still, I waited, patient, letting him tangle himself in his own words until the truth spilled out. And then, as casually as one might comment on the weather, he said it. "You know, this place would make the perfect family retreat. Everyone would be so comfortable here. We could bring the kids down for summers, maybe even host holidays. It would mean so much to them." The way he said it was smooth, practiced, as though he believed I had already agreed, as though this was a foregone conclusion, and my only role was to nod and smile. His tone wasn't one of asking, it was one of assuming. He looked at me with that smug half-grin, waiting for the gratitude, for the eager acceptance, for the foolish generosity he had grown so accustomed to exploiting. In his mind, the beach house wasn't mine. It was theirs, waiting to be claimed, waiting to be folded into the empire of entitlement they had built on the back of my sacrifices. And beneath the syrup of his words, I heard the unspoken truth loud and clear. They had come not to reconcile, not to heal, not to restore what they had shattered, but to take. They wanted the house, not me. They wanted the view, not the man who had built it. They wanted to stand in this sanctuary and call it theirs, erasing the 6 years of silence as if they had never existed. For a moment, rage threatened to claw its way to the surface, but I swallowed it down, forcing my face to remain calm, because I knew that to expose my fury too soon would be to give him power. Instead, I let the words echo in my mind, rolling them over and over the perfect family retreat as if they were a bitter mantra, because in those words he had revealed the depth of their greed, the certainty that I was still the same man they had once dismissed, the man who gave and gave until there was nothing left. He thought I would hand over the keys with trembling gratitude, desperate for their approval, willing to buy their affection once more with the currency of my own security. But what he did not understand, what he could not possibly fathom, was that the man standing before him was no longer the broken father he had discarded 6 years ago. I was stronger now, colder, sharpened by betrayal into something unrecognizable to him. He thought he was clever, letting the mask slip only enough to hint at his true desire, but I saw through every layer of his act, and in that moment I realized something with perfect clarity. He had come here to take my house, but instead he had delivered himself into my hands. I let his words hang in the salty air, his casual assumption that my sanctuary was already theirs, echoing in my ears, and though every fiber of me wanted to laugh in his face or slam the door shut, I forced myself to remain calm, thoughtful, almost hesitant, because I knew the power of patience and the strength that lay in letting an opponent believe they were winning. I tilted my head slightly, let my eyes wander as though I were truly considering his suggestion, and I saw his smirk widen just a fraction, that flicker of triumph crossing his face, because in his arrogance he believed I was already bending. Perhaps, I said slowly, the word measured and deliberate, perhaps it would be good for the family to gather here, to see each other again. I watched his posture shift ever so slightly, his chest puffing with pride, as if he had already conquered me, as if 6 years of silence could be erased with one offer of a holiday. Inside, though, my mind was a storm, remembering every night I had spent alone, every birthday without a call, every Christmas where the only sound was the ticking clock, and it was in that storm that my resolve hardened into steel. I would not simply deny him. I would not simply close the door and end it here. No, I would draw them all back, every last one of them, and let them expose themselves in the very house they thought to steal. But not just you, I added, my voice still steady, almost soft. I want my daughter here too, and the children. If this house is to be a place for family, then all of you should see it together. His eyes flickered with something sharp hesitation, perhaps even irritation, but he covered it quickly, nodding, plastering on his mask of politeness once more. Of course, he said smoothly, we can arrange that. They'll be thrilled. Thrilled. The same children who hadn't spoken my name in 6 years, who had been taught to see me as a ghost, would suddenly be thrilled to visit. His lie was so transparent it almost made me smile, but I kept my face impassive, my expression unreadable, because the trap was already set and I would not give him reason to suspect. Inside, though, my thoughts churned with dark satisfaction. Let them come, I thought. Let them all come. Let them walk into this house believing it is theirs for the taking. Let them smile and play at love while their true intentions bleed through in every word and gesture. Let them think they are drawing me back into their orbit when in truth I am pulling them into mine. I had spent 6 years in silence, 6 years being dismissed as unnecessary, 6 years being erased from their lives, and now I would make them face me in the place that symbolized everything they had tried to destroy. I knew what they wanted. I knew why they had come. And soon enough, they would know just how grave a mistake they had made. They thought those 6 years of silence had left me broken, waiting by the phone like a beggar for scraps of affection, but what they never understood was that silence can be a forge, and in that forge I reshaped myself into something far stronger than the man they had once discarded. At first the loneliness consumed me, gnawed at me until I thought it would hollow me out completely. But as the days turned into months and the months into years, I began to see that grief could be transformed into discipline if I channeled it correctly. So while they went about their lives, pretending I did not exist, I set about quietly building a life that no one could take from me again. I pored over my finances, every account, every document, every asset, dissecting them with the precision of a surgeon. Where once I had handed over money without hesitation, now I became meticulous, guarding each dollar like a soldier at his post. I met with bankers who spoke in clipped, professional tones, and I made them explain every clause, every risk, every loophole, until I understood more than they expected an old man to grasp. I sought lawyers, men and women who knew the law like scripture, and with their guidance I constructed protections, trusts, wills, contracts that ensured that everything I owned would be mine until the last breath left my body, and that when it passed on, it would go only to where I chose, not to the hands of those who had betrayed me. I was careful not to leave gaps, careful to make certain that no manipulation, no pressure, no sweet-talking plea could pry what I had built from my grip. At times it felt strange, almost unnatural, to think so coldly about family, to put on paper the boundaries my heart had once refused to draw. But each time doubt whispered to me, I remembered their words, "We don't need you anymore," and the doubt hardened into certainty. I invested wisely, slowly, cautiously, letting my savings grow instead of deplete, and when the time came, I bought the beach house outright. No loans, no strings, no shared names on the deed. It was mine, and mine alone, protected by layers of legal steel that no smiling son-in-law could penetrate. To anyone else, it might have looked as though I had simply retreated into retirement, spending my days repairing an old house by the sea. But beneath that quiet exterior, every move was deliberate, every decision sharpened by betrayal. I documented everything, filed copies in places only I knew, told no one the full scope of what I had done, because secrecy was my shield. They believed 6 years of silence had left me vulnerable, but in truth those years were my rebirth, the years in which I laid foundations not of sacrifice but of control, the years in which I learned that the greatest act of survival is not clinging to love that is poisoned, but building a fortress strong enough to keep the poison out. So when I stood in the doorway and saw my son-in-law's greedy eyes roaming over my home, I knew something he did not. Every inch of this place, every brick, every paper tied to it, was locked in a way he could never touch. What he saw as a prize waiting to be claimed was in truth a snare waiting to close around him, because I had prepared for this moment, even if I hadn't known it then. The silence they had given me became the weapon I would use against them. When she finally arrived, it was almost surreal, as though I were watching a play I had seen 1,000 times in dreams and nightmares. But now, the actress who had once been my daughter stepped onto the stage wearing a mask so thin I could see the cracks forming beneath it. She stood there on my porch, the ocean breeze tugging at her hair, her voice dripping with a sweetness that rang false to my ears. The moment she spoke that word she had denied me for 6 long years. "Dad," the sound of it was like a ghost brushing past me, familiar yet foreign. Once a word filled with love and comfort, now twisted into something brittle and insincere. She stepped forward quickly, almost too quickly, arms outstretched as though expecting me to melt into her embrace. And for a brief second I saw the children behind her, their faces wide-eyed and uncertain, glancing at me, not with recognition, but with the puzzled curiosity one might give a stranger they'd been told was important, but never truly known. "We've missed you," she said, her tone rehearsed, her eyes glistening just enough to mimic tears. But I could see the calculation behind them, the performance carefully prepared to soften me, to make me forget that for 6 years she had allowed me to rot in silence. My hands itched to reach for my grandchildren, to pull them close and breathe them in, but their little bodies stayed pressed against her sides, confused, wary, as though they sensed the tension that hung between us like storm clouds. She prompted them gently, almost nervously. "Say hello to Grandpa." And they mumbled polite greetings, words that should have filled me with joy, but instead stabbed me with the bitter truth that they said them, the way children recite lines taught in school, words stripped of familiarity, of warmth. I bent slightly, forcing my smile, whispering their names like a prayer I had repeated every night in silence. But I could see in their eyes that my name had been reduced to a faint echo in their world. Something spoken rarely, if at all. Behind her sweetness was a desperation she could not fully hide, a need sharpened into urgency by the sight of the house standing tall behind me. And though her lips curved into a smile, her eyes flickered nervously between me and the home, as though measuring how best to slip her claim into the conversation. "Dad," she said again, softer this time, her hand brushing my arm as though the simple touch could erase the years. "We should never have lost touch. The kids need you. I need you. And this house, it could be where we start over." Her voice cracked at the edges, not with genuine emotion, but with the strain of someone forcing themselves into a role they did not believe. And the irony of it almost made me laugh. For years I had dreamed of hearing her call me Dad again, dreamed of her running into my arms, dreamed of the grandchildren knowing me as more than a ghost. But now that it was here, I felt nothing but a cold, steady clarity. This was not love returned. It was hunger, disguised as reconciliation. I let her speak, let her pull the children forward awkwardly, as though pushing them into a photograph they didn't want to take. And I stood calm, silent, masking the storm inside me. I could see her frustration flicker, the way her smile stiffened when I did not immediately fold, the way her voice grew brighter, sweeter, almost frantic, as she tried to fill the silence with declarations of family and second chances. But behind all of it, behind the practiced tone and the forced affection, I could hear the whisper of the truth. She was here not for me, not for the children, but for the house. And if she thought she could play this part and fool me, she had forgotten who taught her how to read between the lines in the first place. At first they kept the act polished, every word dipped in syrup, every gesture meant to project the image of a family eager to mend old wounds. But a mask worn too long always slips, and theirs began to crumble the moment I refused to be swept along by their rehearsed enthusiasm. My daughter sat across from me at the kitchen table, her children restless and fidgeting nearby, while my son-in-law leaned casually against the counter, as though he owned the place already, his eyes scanning the rooms with a greedy hunger he could not disguise. "Dad, this house is just beautiful," my daughter said, her smile stretched thin, her tone brittle from overuse. "It feels like it was meant for all of us. Don't you think the kids would love spending summers here?" I gave no answer, only sipped my coffee and let the silence bloom heavy around us. And in that silence, I saw her eyes flicker with irritation. She tried again, sharper this time. "It's big enough for everyone. We could finally be together like a real family again." Before I could respond, my son-in-law cut in, his voice just a little too quick, a little too sharp. "Of course, it would only make sense for us to use it. A house like this shouldn't just sit with one person rattling around inside. You don't need all this space." His words hung in the air, more revealing than he intended, and I watched as my daughter glanced at him with a flash of panic, the script cracking under his impatience. She tried to cover for him, her tone turning falsely soothing. "What he means, Dad, is that you'd be happier if you weren't alone so much. You've always been generous, and this house, well, it could bring us all together." But her voice trembled just enough to betray her nerves, and my silence stretched again, forcing the truth to ooze through the seams of their performance. Finally, unable to restrain himself, my son-in-law pushed off the counter and leaned closer, his polished smile gone, replaced by the sharp edge of entitlement. "Look, We all know you can't make use of a place like this the way we could. Think about the kids, think about the family. Wouldn't it be better if it belonged to all of us? You've had your time. Now it's our turn." His arrogance filled the room like a stench, and in his impatience the charade was stripped bare. The grandchildren sat frozen, confused by the sudden tension, their wide eyes darting from face to face as though trying to understand why the air had turned heavy. My daughter's mask slipped further, her sweetness curdling into irritation. "Why are you being so difficult, Dad?" she snapped softly, the edge in her voice betraying years of disdain just beneath the surface. "After everything you've done for us, after everything we've been through, can't you just trust us to make the most of this house? We're your family. We deserve this." Deserve. The word struck me like a bell, resonating with the arrogance that had defined them from the beginning, the arrogance that had cost me 6 years of silence. I let their words hang in the air, their clumsy performance collapsing into raw greed, and though my face remained calm, inside I felt a cold satisfaction blooming, because they had finally revealed themselves not as loving children seeking reconciliation, but as opportunists circling what they thought was easy prey. What they didn't know, what they couldn't yet see, was that I was no longer the man they had discarded, and their greed had already delivered them into the jaws of the trap I had been patiently constructing. I let the silence stretch until it was heavy enough to suffocate them, until their forced smiles had long since faded into strained grimaces and their children shifted uncomfortably in the corner, sensing the storm that was about to break. Then, in a voice calm and steady, I finally spoke. "You don't need to dance around it anymore," I said, setting my cup gently on the table, the sound of porcelain on wood sharp as a blade cutting through their lies. My daughter's eyes flicked nervously toward her husband, and his jaw tightened, but I didn't give them the chance to interrupt. "I know exactly why you're here. This house isn't about family. It isn't about second chances. It's about greed." My words landed heavy, and I saw my son-in-law's mask crack completely, his smirk collapsing into a scowl. "That's ridiculous," my daughter began, her voice rising in forced indignation. But I cut her off with a wave of my hand, my patience worn thin after years of silence. "Do you think I've forgotten?" I asked, my voice suddenly sharp, echoing off the walls. "Do you think 6 years is long enough for a man to erase the last words his own daughter and her husband threw in his face? Because I haven't. I remember every single one." I leaned forward, my eyes fixed on hers, and I watched the color drain from her cheeks as I whispered the words that had haunted me every night since that evening. "We don't need you anymore." The silence that followed was suffocating, my grandchildren staring wide-eyed as if hearing a family secret that had never been meant for their ears. My daughter's lips parted as if to protest, but no words came, and her eyes glistened with a mixture of shame and anger. My son-in-law, however, recovered faster, his arrogance rushing back like a tide. "You're twisting things," he snapped. But there was no conviction behind it, only desperation. I turned my gaze on him, cold and unwavering. "No," I said firmly, "I am not twisting anything. I am reminding you. You told me to my face that I was a burden. You told me that I wasn't needed, that I had no place in your lives. You closed the door on me. You cut me off from my grandchildren. And you left me to rot in silence for 6 years. And now, suddenly, you show up at my door, not because you've remembered I exist, not because you regret what you've done, but because you think you can sink your claws into the only thing I have left." My daughter reached out across the table, her voice trembling as she tried to recover her performance. "Dad, it wasn't like that. We were under stress. Don't, I said sharply, pulling back from her touch. Don't insult me further by pretending you don't remember. You let him speak those words and you stood there in silence. You chose him over me. And now you want me to forget that? To hand you the keys to the one place I have built for myself? No, not this time. Their carefully constructed charade lay in ruins now, their greed exposed, their arrogance naked before me. My son-in-law straightened, his voice rising in frustration. You can't hold one conversation over our heads forever. Families fight, things get said. But this house, it's bigger than you. You should be thinking about us, about the kids, not clinging to your pride. I met his glare with one of my own, my voice low and unwavering. This house is mine. And for once in your life, you're going to understand that my pride is worth more than your greed. And as the waves crashed outside, pounding against the shore like drums of war, I saw in their faces the realization that I was not the man they had once dismissed, not the weak, pliable father they could manipulate with guilt and obligation. I was something far stronger, and I would not yield. I let them stew in the silence of my words, their eyes darting between each other as if searching for some hidden script that might guide them out of the corner they had painted themselves into. And then I leaned back in my chair, folded my hands, and delivered the truth that would crush whatever hope they had brought with them. You came here believing this house was yours for the taking, I said, my tone calm but edged with steel. You thought I would roll over like the fool you once believed me to be, hand you the keys, and let you erase 6 years of betrayal with a smile. But you've miscalculated, and it's time you know the truth. My daughter's lips trembled as she tried to speak, but I pressed on, my gaze steady. This house is not yours, and it never will be. It is not even mine to give anymore. It has already been placed in a trust. Every brick, every window, every inch of sand it sits upon is legally protected, locked away beyond the reach of either of you. My son-in-law scoffed, a hollow, brittle sound meant to disguise the flicker of panic in his eyes. A trust? For what? You can't just... I cut him off with a raised hand, savoring the moment. For charity, I said coldly, and for the education of your children. My grandchildren will have opportunities, security, and a future that you could never strip from them. But you, I turned my eyes on him, watching the blood drain from his face. You will have no control, no access, no say. This house, this sanctuary, will serve a purpose long after I am gone, but it will never serve your greed. My daughter gasped, her voice breaking as she leaned forward, desperation seeping through the cracks in her performance. Dad, how could you do this without telling me? We could have managed it together, kept it in the family. The family? I snapped, my voice sharp enough to make her flinch. You speak of family now, after shutting me out, after letting him tell me I was no longer needed, after keeping my grandchildren from me for 6 long years. No, you don't get to invoke family now. Family is built on love, on loyalty, on sacrifice, and I gave all of that until there was nothing left. You gave me silence, you gave me rejection, and now you come here demanding what you think is owed to you? I shook my head slowly. It's too late. My son-in-law's composure shattered, his voice rising with fury. You can't do this. You can't just cut us out like that. We're your blood, your heirs. I leaned forward, my voice dropping into a calm, final certainty. I can, and I have. You thought blood was enough to bind me to your greed, but blood means nothing when poisoned by betrayal. You are not my heirs. You are the authors of my exile. and the only legacy you will inherit from me is the knowledge that I outwitted you." The room was silent, except for the crashing of the waves outside, each one pounding against the shore like a victory drum. My daughter covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes wide with disbelief, her children staring at her with confusion they couldn't yet voice, and my son-in-law stood rigid, his fists clenched, his arrogance finally stripped away to reveal the hollow greed beneath. And in that silence, I felt it, the weight I had carried for 6 years lifting from my chest, replaced by a cold, clean vindication. I had been their victim once, but not anymore. The moment the truth settled over them was the moment their carefully constructed arrogance began to unravel, and it was almost poetic to watch the collapse unfold before me. My son-in-law's face, usually so smug and composed, twisted into something ugly and desperate, his voice rising with the shrillness of a man who suddenly realized the game he thought he controlled had slipped from his grasp. "You can't do this!" he shouted, slamming his fist against the table so hard the coffee cup rattled. "You can't just lock us out like that! We're your family! Your blood! We have a right to this house!" His rage filled the room, his arrogance crumbling into panic, and for the first time in years I saw the truth of him without the mask, not a confident man but a parasite who had finally been cut off from his host. My daughter, meanwhile, tried a different tactic, her voice breaking as tears welled in her eyes. But even her tears rang hollow to me, too late, too rehearsed. She reached for my hand across the table, her fingers trembling as she whispered, "Dad, please, don't do this. We made mistakes, but we can fix them. The kids deserve to know you, to have you in their lives. Don't punish them for our mistakes." Her words, sweet on the surface, were laced with desperation, a plea not for love but for control, and I could see the conflict in her eyes as she tried to summon the daughter I once knew but could not find her anymore. She begged, she pleaded, her voice breaking into sobs as she clutched at my hand, but behind her tears I could still see the shadow of entitlement, the unspoken expectation that I would fold as I always had, that I would let her weeping soften me into surrender. But I was not the same man who had once given until I had nothing left. I sat calm and still, my expression resolute, letting their storm rage around me without yielding an inch. The waves outside pounded against the shore in rhythm with my heartbeat, steady and strong, and I felt the years of grief and loneliness harden into the steel of my resolve. "You closed the door on me," I said quietly, my voice cutting through their shouting and sobbing like a knife through cloth. "You shut me out, told me I wasn't needed, barred me from the lives of my grandchildren. And now you come crawling back, not out of love, not out of regret, but because you thought you could take what I built from the ashes of your betrayal. But I will not be your victim again." My son-in-law snarled, his composure gone, his fists clenched white, and for a moment I saw the impulse in his eyes to strike, to lash out like a cornered animal. But he stopped himself, perhaps realizing that such an act would strip the last shred of dignity from their performance. My daughter wept openly, clinging to her children, whispering to them that I didn't mean it, that I was just angry, that I would come to my senses. But I meant every word, and I had never been more certain of anything in my life. I stood slowly, letting my chair scrape across the floor, and I looked down at them, not with anger anymore, but with the calm finality of a man who had endured the worst and emerged unbroken. "I gave you everything once," I said, my voice steady, "and you threw it away. Now I give you nothing, and it is more than you deserve." Their arrogance was gone, their performance shattered, and all that remained was the wreckage of their greed, laid bare in the house they had thought to claim. I was calm, resolute, untouchable, and they knew it. I looked at them, my daughter crumpled in her chair with tears streaking her face, my son-in-law pacing like a caged animal with fury rolling off him in waves, the grandchildren staring in wide-eyed silence, not fully understanding the storm that had erupted around them, and I felt something inside me shift, not rage, not sorrow, but a deep, steady certainty that the time for silence had ended. I drew a long breath and let my voice fill the room, calm but strong, every word sharpened by the years of pain they had forced me to endure. "Do you think I don't remember what I gave up for you?" I asked, my eyes fixed on my daughter, though my words were meant for them both. Every sleepless night, every aching bone, every dollar saved when I should have been living for myself, I poured it all into you. I denied myself comforts. I worked when my body begged for rest. I scraped and struggled so that you would never know hunger, so that you would stand taller than I ever could. I paid for your education. I gave you the wedding of your dreams. I emptied my pockets into the hands of a man who promised to take care of you and instead took care only of himself. And how was I repaid? With silence, with doors slammed in my face, with the cruelest words a father could ever hear. "We don't need you anymore." My daughter's sobs grew louder, but I pressed on, the momentum of truth carrying me like a tide. "For 6 years you left me alone. 6 years of empty birthdays, of Christmases where the only sound in my house was the clock ticking. 6 years where I bought gifts for children who never received them, wrote letters that were never read, and tried to convince myself I was still a father, still a grandfather, even as you erased me from your lives. Do you know what it's like to sit in silence so heavy you feel it pressing on your chest? To wonder if the people you love most are even capable of remembering your face? I lived that. I bled through that, and you never cared." I turned then to my son-in-law, whose face was flushed with fury, and let my words strike him like hammer blows. "You thought I was a fool. You thought I was just a bank to be emptied, a back to be broken, a man too weak and desperate for affection to ever stand against you. But you miscalculated. The silence you gave me, the rejection you forced on me, it forged me into something you cannot bend anymore. You thought you would come here, smile that smug smile, dangle my grandchildren in front of me like bait, and I would hand you the keys to everything I had built. But I am not that man anymore. I am not your victim. I am not your fool. And I will never again be the sacrifice you feed upon." The room was still, except for the sound of waves outside, pounding against the shore as if the ocean itself was echoing my words. And I felt my voice grow even steadier, rising with the force of finality. "This house is mine, not as a possession but as a symbol. It represents every day I chose to rise, when despair tried to drown me. Every night I refused to let your cruelty define the rest of my life. You thought you could take it from me, but you cannot, because I have already secured it for those who deserve it, your children, my grandchildren, and causes that will outlive us all. You will never touch it. You will never touch me again. I am free of you." Their faces were pale, stricken, their arrogance shattered, and their begging exposed for what it was. And I felt no hatred in that moment, only vindication. "You wanted to remind me I was not needed," I said, softer now, but no less powerful. "Well, let me return the truth to you. I no longer need you. Not your approval, not your presence, not your false love. I am done carrying the weight of your betrayal. My life is my own." The waves crashed steadily against the shore outside, as if marking the beat of my resolve, and I stood with a calmness that seemed to unnerve them more than any shouting ever could. My daughter clung to the edge of the table, tears streaking her face, her voice trembling as she tried one last desperate plea. "Dad, please don't do this. We can fix this. We can start over. The kids, they need you." Her words were hollow, brittle, too late. My son-in-law's mask had long since shattered, his voice thick with fury as he spat. "You're making a mistake. You'll regret this when you're old and alone, when this house is empty and worthless without us. You can't just cut us out." I turned to face them both fully, my posture straight, my voice steady, every syllable heavy with finality. "You cut me out 6 years ago," I said quietly, but the weight of the truth made the words strike harder than any shout. "You told me I wasn't needed. You barred me from my grandchildren. You left me alone when I had nothing but the love I wanted to give. And now, after all of that, you think you can walk back into my life and take the one thing I built from the ruins of your betrayal? No. This house is mine, and you will not pollute it with your greed." My daughter reached for me, desperation shining in her eyes, but I stepped back, the distance between us now more than physical. I had mourned the loss of her long ago. Now I was simply acknowledging it aloud. I drew in a breath, let it out slowly, and with a calm voice that cut sharper than any rage, I gave the words that would end this charade once and for all. "Get out." The room froze, the air thick with finality. My son-in-law's face twisted in outrage, but there was no argument left for him to make, no mask he could hide behind, and he knew it. My daughter's sobs broke the silence, but even her tears could not erase what had been done. I walked to the door, my footsteps deliberate, and pulled it open, the cool ocean breeze rushing in to cleanse the air thick with their poison. "This is my home," I said, my voice unwavering, "and you are not welcome here, not now, not ever." They hesitated, my daughter looking at me as though hoping for a last flicker of weakness, my son-in-law glaring as if trying to scorch me with his eyes. But I stood unmoved, the years of silence and betrayal having forged me into stone. Finally, with muttered curses and broken sobs, they gathered their children and shuffled toward the door. My grandchildren glanced at me, confusion clouding their innocent faces, and my heart ached for them, but I reminded myself that this was not their fault, and that in time the provisions I had made would speak for me louder than any words could now. One by one, they stepped across the threshold, and when the last of them was outside, I placed my hand on the door and closed it slowly, deliberately, the sound of the latch clicking shut, echoing like thunder in my chest. With that single motion, I sealed more than just the entrance to my home. I sealed off 6 years of manipulation, of silence, of pain. The door stood between us like a wall, and for the first time in years I felt free. The house was quiet again after they left. The air no longer heavy with false sweetness and greedy demands, only the soft rhythm of the waves outside rising and falling like the breath of the world itself. I lowered myself into my chair by the window, the one place in this home where I could see the horizon stretch endlessly across the water, and I felt the weight of 6 years finally lift from my chest. For so long I had carried their rejection like a stone tied around my neck, dragging me down into silence and despair, but tonight that stone was gone, cut loose with the truth I had spoken and the door I had closed. I sat with my hands folded, my body still, and listened to the ocean, its song weaving through the open windows like a hymn of renewal. The salt in the air stung my eyes. Or maybe it was the tears that finally came, not tears of sorrow this time, but of release, of peace. For years I had prayed for reconciliation, begged the heavens in my solitude that they would come back to me, not for my possessions, but for my love, for the bond we once shared. But now I saw clearly that what I longed for was already gone, burned away by their own words, their own choices, and what remained was not family but memory. And yet, instead of despair, I felt calm, because I had faced them. I had spoken the words that had sat in my chest like burning coals, and I had not bent beneath their pressure. I had given them nothing, and in that nothing, I had finally reclaimed everything. I looked around the house, the repaired walls, the gleaming floors, the windows that let in the endless sea, and I realized it had fulfilled its purpose. It was never meant to be a palace or a trophy. It was a sanctuary, a place where I rebuilt myself piece by piece, and now it stood as proof that betrayal does not have to be the end, that silence can be transformed into strength. I thought of my grandchildren, their confused eyes staring at me as their parents dragged them away, and though pain pricked my heart, I knew I had given them something more valuable than hollow visits or staged affections. The trust was in place, their education secured, their futures protected, and one day, when they were old enough to understand, they would know the truth. Perhaps they would come to see me not as the bitter old man their parents painted, but as someone who loved them enough to shield them from the greed that had poisoned everything else. The waves crashed again, louder this time, as though applauding the thought, and I let the sound wash over me. The loneliness I had feared for years no longer seemed so heavy. It was not absence now, but space. Space I had carved out for myself. Space filled with dignity instead of despair. For the first time in a long while, I was not haunted by the words, "We don't need you anymore." Instead, I heard only my own voice, steady and strong, answering back, "I don't need you either." I leaned back, closed my eyes, and let the ocean's song carry me. Vindication tasted not like triumph or gloating, but like peace. A quiet certainty that I had survived, endured, and emerged whole. The chains were broken. The silence was no longer theirs to wield against me. And in the steady heartbeat of the waves, I found the freedom I had been denied for so long. I was free. At last, I was free. They thought I would break. They thought I would bend. They thought that 6 years of silence would leave me desperate enough to hand over the last piece of myself for a handful of hollow words and false affection. But instead, I stood unyielding, stronger than they had ever imagined, and I closed the door on them and on every chain they had once wrapped around me. The truth is that I had already freed myself long before they came knocking, because while they believed I was wasting away in loneliness, I was rebuilding, fortifying, preparing for the day when they would return with greedy hands outstretched. And when that day came, I was ready. I did not shout. I did not rage. I did not tremble as I once would have. Instead, I delivered the truth with the calm certainty of a man who has endured the worst and come through the other side unbroken. I reminded them of the sacrifices they spat on, of the cruel words they hurled at me, of the 6 years they stole from me, and then I revealed that their scheme had already failed before it began, that the house they coveted had been placed forever out of their reach. Their arrogance collapsed before my eyes, my daughter's tears crumbling into empty pleas, my son-in-law's fury breaking against me like waves against rock, and still I remained still, resolute, immovable. I saw in their faces the dawning horror, that the man they once dismissed as weak and expendable had become something they could neither manipulate nor defeat. And in that moment, I felt the vindication I had longed for. not the fleeting satisfaction of revenge, but the deep, enduring peace of justice served. This house, my sanctuary by the sea, is more than a roof and walls. It is the proof that I survived their abandonment, that I thrived despite their cruelty, that I found renewal in solitude and strength in silence. The waves outside speak to me now, not of loneliness, but of freedom. Each crash against the shore a reminder that I am no longer their victim, no longer their pawn, no longer bound by the chains of guilt or the shackles of obligation. They walked away believing they had erased me, but I remained, and in remaining I rose. And now, as I sit within the walls I restored with my own hands, I know with absolute certainty that they can never touch me again. They came here believing they would walk away with my house, but instead they left with nothing but the memory of their own humiliation, the sting of hearing me reclaim my power, the sight of the door closing on them forever. And I sit here not in bitterness but in triumph, savoring the taste of freedom, knowing I gave them nothing because they had already given me nothing for so long. This is my victory, my peace, my justice, and it will outlast their greed. They may rage, they may beg, they may curse my name, but they will never again strip me of my dignity. That is the final truth. That is the legacy I claim for myself. They came to strip me of everything, but instead I showed them that I was no longer the man they could manipulate, that I was stronger than their silence, sharper than their cruelty, and untouchable in the sanctuary I had built for myself. The house stands as my victory, the ocean sings of my freedom, and the door between us will never open again. Your time means a lot. Thank you for listening to my journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To hear the next story, just click the box on the left.